FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
This talk, the end of the free market question mark, is based on, or if you can, you can see it as a bit of a sequel to a talk I gave back in March this year. And that talk was called Welcome to the New Global Economy. And the theme that I was running with then was that we'd reached an interesting turning point in the way the world economy works. And that the argument was that beginning in the 1980s with a period of liberalization and then gathering force through the 90s and into the earliest part of this century, we'd seen basically the triumph of the free market, the triumph of global financial capitalism. So if you think about the balance of power between states and governments and markets on the other hand, we'd seen this prolonged period where the balance had tilted pretty decisively in favor of the market. And I was making the case back in March, and I'd been making it before then, that what we were seeing is a rebalancing, that the world was starting to tilt back in favor of the state, back in favor of governments. The balance of economic power was shifting. And as part of that speech, I played a little game, which was, which was sort of my version of a dating game, which was it's fun to pick dates for when things change. And I sort of said, well, for example, you can have 28 June 1914. This is Sarajevo, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. That's the start of the First World War. It's the end of the first global economy. We can date it quite precisely. The other date that I played around with, 9 November 1989, fall of the Berlin Wall, start of the new global economy, the triumph of market capitalism. And then I started to have fun, and I was throwing, well, what dates can we think about for a new global economy? And I proposed one, I think, was 2nd April 2007, which is when New Century Financial, at that point the US's second largest subprime lender, files for bankruptcy. And then I had a couple of other suggestions. I think we had August that year when the two Bear Stearns hedge funds went belly up. September when there was the run on Northern Rock, the first run on a British bank since 1866, and then early the following year when you had Northern Rock nationalized. So I was sort of playing around with maybe some of these dates. We now have a stunning new contender that probably pushes all of these aside, and that's 15 September 2008. And that's when the US authorities, perhaps bravely, perhaps foolishly or foolhardily, perhaps with desperate courage, or perhaps just really, really stupidly, let Lehman Brothers go under. And the financial crisis enters a new and much more virulent phase. And within days, you see global financial markets centered around London and New York, but around the globe, basically seizing up, panicking, panic-stricken global financial markets. And the whole system, the whole edifice teeters. And basically we have an unprecedented response by governments around the world who realize that the ad hoc, partial solutions that they've been trying up until then, tinkering at the sidelines, the occasional bailout, occasional part nationalization, aren't going to be enough. You're going to have to go systemic, and you're going to have to go systemic with, in effect, partial effective nationalizations of your financial system. So there's a temptation, clearly, at that point, to say the world changes on 15th of September. My argument about the rebalancing towards the state, away from the market, case closed. Case has been done, case has been made. Unfortunately, that would obviously end the lunch far too early, and you'd probably be rightfully a bit disappointed in me. So we'll expand it, and we'll talk a bit more about it. And I think, and there are sort of some interesting wiggles and qualifications for that. But it is pretty clear that the world looks very different now. And one sort of amusing way of thinking about that is the US economist and blogger Brad DeLong has this great line in a recent op-ed, and he says, think about the Bush administration. The Bush administration come in as social conservatives. Because of this effective bailout of large chunks of the US financial system, they're going to leave office as conservative socialists. Not a prediction that you'd have been making about the Bush administration. Or as Hugo Chavez, the president of Venezuela, put it more pithily, Comrade Bush, how are you? He was quite pleased to see that after having been lectured in the past for nationalizing large chunks of the Venezuelan economy, the Americans had finally caught on to the game and were nationalizing chunks of their own as well. Of course, as the way these things work, the spreading of the emerging markets crisis part of this, and including the tanking of commodity prices, means that President Chavez is probably, some of that schadenfreude is now fading as he looks at the consequences of the way the world's going, and I'll come back to some of that later on. But the way the world works changed on September the 15th. The roots of that change, as I've hopefully made clear in other speeches, lay before then. But it's pretty clear if you want to pick a nice date, and we've got a really good candidate now.